I'm still going to try to keep this to a half hour, so like 25 after 12. If we can be done, that's what I'm going to be aiming for this morning. So, taking a look at Hooker, if you've brought your Hooker books, I want to cover, because this first part of, help yourself if you don't have one. This first part, these first couple chapters, I think are pretty easy to skim through before we start really getting into the meat of the argument next week. So I plan to cover the first 4 chapters all the way up to page, I think it's about 45 this morning. Okay, so, and this book is not terribly long. We should be able to get through it in 3 to 4 weeks, I would say. We'll probably be done. I want to say a word at the beginning, though, about Hooker's method, Hooker's approach to argumentation. So Hooker is a scholastic. So he argues in a scholastic kind of fashion, which is in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so scholastic, what does that mean? Scholasticism, if you didn't notice already in these first couple chapters, there's constantly a breaking down of terms, distinctions being made, and definitions offered. So scholasticism in the modern world kind of gets a bad name sometimes. Scholasticism, the joke associated with it is the question about how many angels can dance on a head of a pin. It seems like an irrelevant question that a scholastic would ask and spend hours debating and discussing. It's actually not irrelevant. It has to do with the question of what are angels. Are angels material or immaterial beings? And if immaterial totally, then you could argue an infinite number could dance on the head of a pin and go down that road in terms of materiality and mortality, immortality, those kinds of questions with regard to angels versus humans. So scholasticism, it's not actually a dirty word despite the fact that it gets a bad name sometimes. It is about making very fine distinctions and defining our terms correctly. And oftentimes I have found, especially in recent years, when theological or political theological worldview kinds of questions are debated, oftentimes you reach simplistic answers simply because distinctions are not being made and qualifications are not being offered. And when you can make distinctions with these various types of things, you can be a whole lot more, careful and clear in your presentation. And actually, it actually avoids a ton of talking past each other when you're careful to make proper distinctions. And so Hooker is very good at doing this. Now, the downside of this approach is as you're reading through Hooker, especially these first couple of chapters, you might be thinking, okay, what does that chapter have to do with the chapter I just read have to do with the previous chapter? Seems like he keeps switching topics, as we're going to see in a moment. But what he's doing in these first couple of chapters is basically setting the table. Okay? And all of these kinds of these terms and points he's making are going to come together later. So he's laying the bowls out on the table and then moving to the heating pads, and then going and getting the silverware, and you think, wait, I thought we were still talking about the bowl. He's setting the table with all of these different chapters, defining his terms, and then he will work them out in relation to each other. So, with that said, in chapter 1, well, it's really chapter 2, but it's point 1, because the dedicatory epistle counts as chapter 1, which we talked about last week. So chapter 2 is entitled Religion and the Commonwealth. And the kind of summary statement, the thesis right at the beginning of the chapter, is that true religion is the root of all virtues and the support of all well-ordered commonwealths. This is a point Hooker would expect his interlocutors to agree upon. So remember, he is debating the Puritans, okay, giving a defense for public worship ceremonies and rites over against the Puritans, who would say, this is not a third-tier adiaphora issue. This is a first-tier theological issue. And two, you can only use the Bible to make your case. Okay? But both sides would agree that a commonwealth, a government, should be Christian. Okay? And that Christianity, religion, is the root of all virtues and the support of all well-ordered commonwealths. This is very different from how we look at politics today. Politics is seen as a neutral area where you need, well, he might be a bad guy personally. He might be irreligious. He might, not have a good family life. He might not be faithful in his marriage, whatever. But he's good on X, or she's good on Y. Where we separate the virtues from political expertise or qualifications. That's a very modern view of politics. That's going to come along really after Hooker. So that's something, and where it comes from, we're going to see in chapter 2, where he's making a kind of a veiled reference to Machiavelli. The idea that you can pursue the good of the Commonwealth or of the polis, the city, apart from virtue. Okay, that's a modern understanding. However, I'll be honest with you, as I read through Hooker in chapter 1, it even was a challenge a little bit to me. I kind of wanted to push back on Hooker because I know too many politicians that are openly Christian, and I could rattle them off for the video and be very partisan and political, but I won't do that, but who are very openly Christian, and I just think have the worst judgment in the world. And I don't want them anywhere near power, which is sad. It's sad that I think a lot of people today who do seek office, even evangelical type people who want to do the right thing, do not understand the art of politics and just have horrible political judgment. So sometimes as I was reading this with Hooker, I'm thinking, man, Hooker's trying to say anybody who add Christianity onto whatever qualification someone has is going to be better. And excuse me, while I want to affirm that, I look at our modern context, and even I am kind of questioning Hooker a little bit. But let's take it, the overall argument of chapter 1 for granted, and this will play into our talk, to our discussion later about public Christianity, public worship. So the best way to summarize 1 is if you turn over to page 25, in the third section, he provides a kind of summary statement on this first point, religion in the Commonwealth. We see, therefore, that the safety of all estates depends on religion, and that true love of religion perfects men's abilities to perform every virtuous service in the Commonwealth. We see also, and he made this point in the previous section, that men desire to hold no religion except the true one, and that if they hold to a false one instead, whatever good effects they enjoy are rooted in certain sparks of truth mixed in with the darkness of error, since no religion can consist simply and solely in untruth. That's a section worth reading if you didn't read it. But he's saying, well, he's dealing with the challenge, what about good, stable, solid governments that aren't Christian around the world? they're not completely chaotic, and he has a strong doctrine of natural law that says that even with these false religions, there are sparks of the truth in them. There's no religion that's completely, utterly, 100% wrong. Okay? You can see this whether even in Islam, Judaism, whatever. There are points at which they are correct. They're distorting the truth, right? Ultimately, but there are points at which they are correct. And this spark of truth comes through to everyone via the created order. So he says, even people who are religious with the wrong religion, it's better than someone who's not religious at all, that doesn't recognize a created order, doesn't recognize a hierarchy, does not recognize a God above them to whom they are accountable. Okay? So that was the point in the second section. And then the third sentence here, this caps everything. Therefore, we have reason to think that all true virtues should honor true religion as their mother, and all well-ordered commonwealths should love her as her surest anchor. So, just in that first chapter, what he is saying is that Christianity is kind of what I mentioned this morning. Christianity, religion is not just an individual thing. Oh, the politician happens to be Christian. The nation, the commonwealth, the people should also be Christian, acknowledge publicly religion, preferably the true religion, which is Christianity, and that this is better for everyone. Okay. His opposition, as I said, would have no disagreement with this. Okay. Chapter 3, beginning on page 27. The danger of atheistic civil religion. And here's the thesis. The extreme opposite of true religion is the profession of atheism. Now, he's not talking just about like atheism today as, I personally don't believe there is a God. But he's talking in a kind of national commonwealth context, a nation that recognizes no God. Okay. He would probably look at the United States of America and say it's a kind of atheistic civil religion because we do not acknowledge any one God. At the very least, maybe an agnostic civil religion is what we have in America. And the key that I would direct your attention to is he says here on page 28 is that a nation determined to be atheistic in its civil religion is acting in this way of kind of suppressing piety and virtue, and it's based on the idea that the civil religion is about ensuring pleasure or profit and avoiding pain. So he says to the top of 28, the root of this impiety is a resolution to reap from the world every sensual profit or pleasure it can yield, and not to be barred from any available means of attaining it. And so you have the people he describes here when you abandon a religious civil government is you have people who rise to the top who are actively doing everything they can to suppress what they know to be true. And what ends up happening when you go over to page 30 and 31 is he says religion ends up is used in a way to support the will of a regime. You've got this kind of civil religion. What he's describing is in the late 1600s and throughout the 1700s, you had a civil religion in many European countries where the civil leaders are not all that Christian. So this came along with the Enlightenment. If you've ever heard of names like Voltaire, okay? Voltaire, writer in the 1700s, very critical of organized, established, traditional Christianity. However, Voltaire, as vile as he may be and hostile to organized, traditional Christianity, Voltaire will tell you that religion is not a bad thing altogether, because religion provides the people with a sense of morality and helps keep order. So if people feel like, now he doesn't believe in Christianity, but if people feel like they need something like that to keep them from being from wrecking the order of society, keep them from robbing banks and creating disorder, that's fine. Religion is good as long as it keeps the people in check. Another name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1700s, born in Geneva, was very critical of established, organized Christianity with doctrinal claims. But he also would say religion can be valuable, because as long as the people believe it and it kind of motivates them to do good and be charitable to their fellow man, why not? Okay? So religion, the point here, why I mentioned Rousseau and Voltaire and people like that, is because what Hooker is saying is that what will happen is people who don't believe will come to find out, and he actually does make this passing reference to Machiavelli on page 31, that religion can be useful to keep order, to hold on to power. And religion is co-opted in that way. So even though the rulers themselves are kind of atheistic, religion becomes co-opted by the worst people. Let's see, what else did I want to highlight? He talks about that in that's, I would say, the main point of 2. And that's why at the beginning of chapter 4, which is point 3, the danger of superstition, he says, therefore, this is page 35, let us move from this accursed crew and deal with the errors on the opposite extreme. So he's dealt with the atheistic side. The errors on the opposite extreme are going to be directed more at the Catholic Church. And here's where he talks about superstition. Okay? So I thought this was probably the most fascinating of the 4 chapters in defining superstition. What is superstition and how does it come about? And he says superstition is motivated by one of 2 things: zeal or fear. Zeal or fear. How so? Let's take fear. Think of a lot of the pagan cultures who sacrifice and do things we would consider superstitious. Let's take one obvious, an extreme example, the Aztecs. Anybody know the history of the Aztecs? The Aztecs would offer human sacrifices, believing their god wanted a still beating heart. And so they would sacrifice by cutting open the chest cavity of their victim and ripping the heart out while it was still pumping blood, okay? Thinking this is going to please their god. And so you look at these practices, we could look at all kinds of different pagan tribes and different sacrifices they do and say, well, that's superstitious, right? But what is motivating it? Fear, right? They don't know their gods. They're afraid of their gods. They're afraid their gods won't send rain unless they do these horrendous things. Whether it's sacrificing human beings or sacrificing animals, you go back and read ancient Greek literature, right? Hey, we're going on a sea voyage. We're afraid of Poseidon. Let's sacrifice some animals because we're afraid. Fear, that kind of fear, leads to superstition. These superstitious practices. If I appease the gods, they'll let me alone, give me safety, maybe even prosperity, but I act out of fear. The other motivator besides fear is zeal. Okay, well, how does zeal work? Zeal is when I truly want to do good things. I want to be pious. And so I add practices into my life that are part of my worship part of my personal holiness and devotion. And I'm kind of a fanatic. I'm motivated by zeal. And I get to the point, kind of like the Pharisees, where all of these things, which may not be bad in and of themselves, are in my own mind what I need to do in order to do it right, so to speak. And you know what? Everybody else needs to too. Okay? Everybody else needs to adopt these things that I have adopted in order to do it right, so to speak, to worship God rightly, or God's not going to answer you. It's a kind of superstitious thing. Think about Paul. Paul talks about his life as a Pharisee as being zealous for the law. He was a zealot for the law. And what did that mean in terms of the Pharisees? The Pharisees want to add all of these things to the law to make sure that they're keeping the law, right? Jesus said that instead of providing for their parents, instead of taking care of their families, they're tithing their dill and their spices, right down to the fraction of an ounce, being so careful because they're trying to assure themselves that they're doing it right, okay? When people started tithing right down to the amount of spice that they had, I'm sure they were probably doing it for a good reason and out of zeal. But that becomes a requirement for everybody else to actually keep the law. And it's out of that zeal, you kind of got a superstitious religion with Judaism at the time of Christ. Now, what he's talking about is Catholicism in the Middle Ages. There are lots of pious practices over the course of the Middle Ages that people had done. You have spiritual people, monks or nuns, or people that devoted themselves to study and to prayer, and they may have come up with routines for prayer, certain kinds of prayers they would pray, certain amount of time each day that they would pray, or little liturgical elements throughout their day that they would do, and these just keep getting added on and added on and added on and become the standard for whether you're actually worshiping right. Are you in the right church? Did you cross all of these? Did you check off all of these boxes? Did you cross all these T's? Did you dot all these I's? And this is why we sometimes, as modern Protestants, look at medieval Catholicism as as superstitious, right? So it's like, oh, you got to do this, and then you got to say these words, and then we can look at it as like, this is why our evangelical friends would be like, why can't you just, pray directly? Why do we have to do any of that liturgy stuff, right? Because all of these rites and ceremonies were accumulated over time, and it looks like they become more important than the essence of the thing that you are participating in, and it's superstitious. For example, so I've mentioned I recently wrote this article on funeral rites in the Middle Ages, and then how they changed over time with various editions of the Book of Common Prayer down to the present. And one of the things that Cranmer did with the funeral and burial rite in the Book of Common Prayer in the first edition is just simplified it. Because the funeral rites in the late Middle Ages were so long. Pages and pages. You got to say a prayer for this one, say a prayer for this saint, say do this one, check this box, then we have this ceremony, then we do this prayer, then we do this speech, and then it would just go on and on and on and on and on. Why? Because probably one time in the 600s, they said, oh, this is a good prayer, right? And then the 700s, let's add this into the funeral rite. And then in the 850s, let's add this in. Oh, in the 950s, we need this. And you just pile it on and pile it on. And there's this thinking in the church that unless we say every word and do everything properly, this person's not going to go to heaven. Right? It's superstitious. If we check all these boxes, but where does it come from? It comes out of a place of zeal. Well, it might be. Fear might factor into that. Well, originally, I would say there's a zealous desire there to do it right or do it better, but it leads to this kind of requirement that unless we do all this, and then, you could say maybe the family says, well, let's do it all right. Let's do it in the right order. And there's elements of this today, even in Roman Catholicism, where I know just a couple of years ago, there's a question about a bunch of people. Josh, I don't know if you remember this, that there were a bunch of people, or a bishop who had been saying, or bishops had been saying the formula wrong in baptism or confirmation. Okay, it was something like that. We baptize you instead of I baptize you. And it was called into question. All these people that had been baptized by this particular bishop, is their baptism legitimate or not, or do we need to go redo it? That's a modern day example of the way the Roman Catholic worldview is. If we get the right formula, and another example of this in the modern day, you can see if you follow Eastern Orthodox conversations online, because you can find lots of young trads who want to go into Eastern Orthodox, and you have all these debates about whose line they're in and which line's more legitimate. Well, my line comes through this guy, whatever. Your line was cut off back in 682, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm the legitimate line. And everybody is, instead of looking to Christ, it's the assurance that I'm in the right church with the right line and whose hands have been properly laid on whom over the course of history. And you get into these kind of superstitious debates. So, Hooker he's critical of superstition and wants to avoid being labeled as superstitious. But that's precisely the charge that his opponents, the Puritans, are leveling against him in the Church of England. So, you could imagine this. We could step into his shoes very easily, because you've probably heard it. If you have friends that are evangelical and you're in an Anglican church, it's like, why are you kneeling? Why do you have to kneel? Why do you have to say that prayer? I can just talk to Jesus. Why do you need to do this? Why do you need to do that? That looks superstitious from the evangelical side, even what we do, right? And that's the kind of claim that Hooker is trying to combat. Recognizing superstition is a problem and is critical of the Roman Catholic Church for engaging in it. But now what he's got to do is try to defend from the criticism coming from the Puritan end that we're not engaging in superstition here by simply having a liturgy, having certain rites and ceremonies. And this is what he says. Hold on. Under chapter 5, are we guilty of superstition? He says, page 42. It's toward the latter half of that long paragraph that takes up most of the page. He says, for so our opponents judge. Our prayers, our sacraments, our fasts, our times and places of public meeting together for the worship and service of God, our marriages, our burials, our ecclesiastical functions, elections, and ordinations, indeed almost whatever religious exercises we do according to established laws, they imagine all these to be corrupt and stained with superstition. Why? Because they had an order to everything, which is what we have in our Book of Common Prayer, right? We have an order for burial. We have an order for marriage. We have an order for ordination. We have orders for worship, for celebrating different feast days, fast days, all of that. And the Puritans would say, none of that is necessary. You just need the Bible. So, for example, like he mentions marriages. The Puritans were opposed to even using a ring in marriage, because they said things, physical objects, cannot be blessed. Only people can be blessed. So you shouldn't use rings because you're looking at rings as a token. They don't like looking at any image or figure of something that has a higher reality to it. So just in the same way as the Puritans would say, don't decorate your sanctuary. Don't put images of saints in your sanctuary or images of Christ, or don't add ornamentation. It should just be all white, nothing to imagine, so that you can think on Christ, right? Nothing to distract you. No decoration, ornamentation, imagery. The same with rings in marriage. Don't attribute your marriage to the ring, right? It's a higher reality, okay? So don't get into these superstitious, oh, I have my ring, I have my tool, I have my chant, I have my prayer, they don't like the organized prayers either, because that might be, if it's a written down prayer, you might be using it as a spell, like a chant, like, oh, this is my magic prayer if I just repeat the Lord's Prayer. So don't do that. Speak from the heart and don't rely on pre-written words or anything like that, okay? So everything, then this, how this actually, it's funny how it shows up even in burials, since I've been writing about burials and funerals lately, is the order, the Westminster order that came out in 1645 in the midst of the Civil War between the Royalists and the Cromwell and the Puritans. The order that comes out, it says, for a funeral, just this is a crude way of saying it, it's just like dump the body in the grave. No, there's no singing or reciting of psalms should be done while walking to the grave. No minister is needed, just a cleric there to record it, and no singing or chanting on the way back. It's like, you can't recite a psalm, you can't. So it was just very, very minimal because they're afraid of superstitions and rites coming back into the church. So it's all just stripped down. It's like you just go there, say a prayer. It's not about the body. There's no soul left in that body. Just put it in the ground, say a prayer to God, move on, get on with your day. Yeah.
Puritans' counter-reaction to any of this kind of liturgy use the word fear again. So even
there is a kind of fear in there, right?
A certain kind of superstition. They're also doing that.
It's a good, yeah.
Creates their own like anti-superstition. It's like matter and
Right,
like
right.
that.
No, that's. I think that's a fair point. So anyway, he says that they criticize every one of our ceremonies for being superstitious, and so the whole point of this book going forward is to combat that. And so I want to close with this on pages, the bottom of 43 and 44. Those are the last two pages, and this is an important distinction. Like I said, these first several chapters are setting the table. So we've agreed. A Christian magistrate, a Christian government is good for a commonwealth. In other words, we don't want to follow the route of just saying, well, let's just take it all out of the public sphere and everybody do their own thing and have a kind of atheistic or agnostic kind of government. That's what we do today. But we also want to combat superstition, okay? And we're being accused of superstition. And so here's the last important distinction, and this is what we'll be spending more time on later. But just recording it here, this is another distinction he makes. This is last full paragraph, 43. The worship of God is twofold. One inward and spiritual. Here he references Romans 12:1. This is about the renewing of your mind. This is your reasonable or spiritual service. The other involving a solemn outward service. Here he references Luke 1:23. This verse talks about when Zechariah finished his duties in the temple and returned back home. Zechariah, this is his public service. This is not his personal piety. Okay? One is inward, one is outward. The first, the inward and spiritual category, includes all manner of virtuous duties that each man, in reason and conscience, owes to God. The second includes whatever belongs to the church or public society public society of God by means of external adoration. It is the latter which gives rise to our present debates. This outward service is ordered partly with respect to principal matters by divine precepts alone, and partly with respect to more trivial matters by both human and divine ordinances. Regarding the former, which comprises the substance of religion in which God's law alone must be observed, there's no debate between us and the Puritans on the big theological issues. The crime now charged against us, though, is that when it comes to those secondary matters, whether the exercise of public religious duties or the functions of persons authorized to perform them, our laws have not ordered them rightly, and that our customs are either superstitious or otherwise amiss. So this is a key distinction for the Reformers. Another way of talking about this is two kingdoms. The two kingdoms are not, as they're often presented today, if you hear people popularly talk about two kingdoms, they are not the church and the state. Okay? That is not how the scholastic reformers talked about the two kingdoms. Oh, the state's over here, the church is over here. No. The two kingdoms are the inward life and the outward public life. The inward life is the life of the conscience. And in the realm of conscience, the state cannot touch it. The church cannot touch it, right? They can't. This is why martyrs went to their deaths, not changing their minds. They can't touch the conscience, okay? But the other side is the outward expression of Christianity, which actually both the state and the church are in that realm, okay? So it's not church versus state. It's inward conscience and outward conformity to the expressions, how religion is expressed, how worship is conducted. That's the outward kingdom, okay? So he says those are the inward versus outward, and then he takes the outward and breaks that down. He says when it comes to outward worship, there are matters that are based on God's law, Scripture alone, and then there are matters that are more trivial, that are based on human ordinances. He says we have no disagreement about the fundamental issues of the outer kingdom. We agree that the state should be Christian. We agree that the church should worship, the true God and not be superstitious, all that. On those issues, we have no disagreement. What we're talking about here is the outward public expression of Christianity, that realm, and in matters that should be considered trivial, secondary issues, that where man's ordinances do come into play. Common sense comes into play. Reason comes into play. History comes into play. So that's the fundamental difference here. Can we draw on the example of the church? Can we draw on reason? Can we draw on common sense? Can we draw on history? Can we draw on these things? Does the church have any authority to make rules for everybody for this is how we're going to worship in this realm? Or do we make all of these trivial things my Bible alone? Where does it say in my Bible that I have to do this? Right? So it's one thing to say, if you don't believe in purgatory, you're going to hell. It's another thing to say, well, why do I kneel when taking communion? Okay? One is a more substantive matter where the church is claiming if you don't believe in this doctrine, you're anathema. And if they're going to say that, you need to say with the 39 articles, where is that in Scripture that I'm anathema if I don't believe this? Or there's another that says, here's the way we practice communion. You come forward, kneel at the altar, receive communion. Because the Puritans, by the way, that was another fight. The Puritans were, why do I have to kneel? Who said? Why didn't make me? Who said? Where in the Bible does it say I have to kneel? Dang it. So, and the question is, you don't have to find it in your Bible, okay? This is how we've decided to practice it. Come forward for communion, okay? This is how we've decided to do marriages, okay? This is the burial rite. This is the standard rite. So this is a different question than how dare you get to my conscience. Well, this isn't a conscience matter. This is not a doctrinal matter. This is not a first-tier issue. So inward and outward kingdom, it's an important distinction for the Reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin, all of them framed it this way, inward versus outward kingdom. And second, within that outward kingdom, there are certain things we have to do as a church. We have to preach the word. We have to offer sacraments. No disagreement on that. We're talking about these other issues. How many deacons do we have? Do we have bishops, deacons, and presbyters, or just presbyters and deacons? Do you have ruling elders versus preaching elders? All these sorts of questions. Where in the Bible are you going to find the answer to all these questions? You're not. Okay? So in matters of secondary importance, does the church and the state, because this is an official church, have a role for providing order? Saying, you know what? So that we're not constantly splitting apart and with these controversies and everybody's got their own opinion and new way of doing it. This is the way we're going to do it in England. Is there a basis for that, or is that superstition? Right? Are we just like the Roman Catholics? Okay, that is the hair that Hooker's trying to split, the needle that he is trying to thread between the superstition and between the other pole, which is every man for himself, because we don't have a common civil religion. We have an agnostic civil religion where we privatize it and everybody does their own thing. Okay? Any quick questions? Because I went over. But, all right, let's close in prayer. Our Father, thank you for this day, Lord, that you have made. And we thank you for, again, this opportunity to worship you this day without fear and in public. We thank you for the truth of your word. We thank you for the practices of the church, the battles that had been fought for doctrine and the ways of worshiping you in a biblical manner. These issues that have been worked out for so long and over such a long period of time, from which we can benefit today. And so we thank you for the opportunity, for the resources that you have given to us, the time to study these things. And we ask, Lord, that in the end, this would all be a blessing to us and prove to magnify your name in how we worship, how we minister, how we interact with other branches of your church. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.